I'm Nathaniel Calloway, 68 years old. My son-in-law paid a doctor $50,000 to fake a report saying my mind was gone, so he could take the company I spent 40 years building. He thought nobody was watching. He was wrong. Tell me where you're listening from, and let's begin. My name is Nathaniel Calloway, and at 68 years old, I found out my own daughter had paid a doctor $11,000 to write a medical report saying my mind was falling apart. I had never met the man. I had never sat in his office. But there it was, on official letterhead, with my name, my birth date, and a diagnosis that would have handed my company to my son-in-law before Christmas. I read every page twice, and I could not help but laugh. Tell me if your own family tried to fake a diagnosis just to take what you had spent 40 years building. Would you forgive them, or would you make them regret it? That story starts 3 weeks earlier, on a night I was never supposed to remember this clearly. I stood at the front desk of my own company at 9 in the evening, staring at a security log that told me my son-in-law was still inside the building, even though he had promised me hours earlier that he was already boarding a flight to Dallas, Texas. A flight that, as far as the building's own records were concerned, he had never actually left the ground to catch. The log showed his badge scanning into the lobby at 4:15 that afternoon, the exact same hour he claimed to already be sitting inside an airport terminal. There was no record of him badging back out at any point that evening. The night guard, a young man named Diego, who had worked that shift for almost 2 years, told me the west stairwell camera near the old records room had conveniently stopped working earlier that same week, which struck both of us as far too convenient to actually be an accident. I did not call out for him. I did not confront anyone standing in that lobby that night. I simply folded the printed log sheet, slid it into my coat pocket, and walked toward the executive floor with one question circling through my mind and refusing to leave it alone. If Marcus was still somewhere inside this building, hiding behind a stairwell camera that had broken at exactly the right moment, who exactly was he meeting? And why did he need his own wife and me to believe he was 300 miles away in another state entirely? To understand how I ended up standing in that lobby at 9 o'clock with a stolen log sheet in my pocket, you have to go back to that same morning when everything still looked completely ordinary. I run Calloway Infrastructure Group, a company I built from a used pickup truck and a box of hand tools 4 decades ago, back when Austin was still a small town rather than a skyline of glass towers. This year marked our 35th anniversary, and I had planned a small dinner to celebrate it, senior staff and family only. Nothing more elaborate than that. I called my son-in-law, Marcus Reyes, that morning to confirm the date and the guest list for the dinner. Marcus had worked his way up to Vice President of Business Development, a title I gave him myself. No favors involved in any part of that promotion. He answered on the second ring and told me he could not make the planning call that afternoon. A client in Dallas was threatening to pull a 7-figure contract, he said, and he needed to fly out immediately to fix things in person, before the deal collapsed entirely. He apologized twice and hung up before I could ask him which client, which contract, or which flight he was taking. An hour later, my longtime assistant Ruth called me with something odd. A courier had dropped off a sealed envelope at the office, addressed to me, no return address, no company name printed anywhere on it, delivered by hand instead of by mail. The courier had refused to leave it with the front desk and insisted on waiting until someone from executive management signed for it personally. Ruth signed for it herself and locked it inside my private drawer, the one drawer in my office that only she and I have keys to. A drawer that had not been opened in months. I asked her to open it and read me the contents over the phone right away. She went quiet for a moment before telling me the envelope was not addressed to me directly at all. It was addressed to my desk, which struck her as strange, since a letter addressed to a piece of furniture, rather than an actual person, made no sense to either one of us. Inside was a single, unsigned page with exactly one line of text. It read, "Do not sign anything this month without reading every clause twice." I asked her to read it back to me again, slower this time. The words did not change no matter how many times she repeated them. No name, no explanation, no return address. Just a quiet warning, delivered by a courier who refused to leave without a signature, sealed inside an envelope addressed to a piece of furniture in my own private office. I told her to lock it back in the drawer and say absolutely nothing about it to anyone else in the building, not even security. By late afternoon, Marcus called back, his tone lighter now, saying the Dallas situation had resolved itself faster than expected, and he would be home by the weekend after all. I thanked him and said nothing about the envelope sitting locked in my drawer, waiting for me like a loaded question. Something about the timing of his sudden good news bothered me far more than his earlier bad news ever had, though I could not yet explain exactly why that was. That evening, instead of driving home, I drove straight to the office, telling myself I only wanted to review a set of blueprints before the weekend began. When I pulled into the parking garage, I noticed Marcus's car parked in a visitor spot instead of his usual reserved space, as if he had wanted it to look like he had never come into the building that day at all, which was exactly the moment that sent me walking straight toward the front desk, the security log, and the lie that was waiting there to be found. 3 words stopped me cold outside that door, spoken in a voice I did not recognize. He doesn't need to know anything until it's already signed. I stood there in the dark hallway outside Marcus's private conference room, my hand frozen an inch from the handle, listening to a stranger discuss my future like I was a line item on a spreadsheet, rather than the man who built the walls he was standing inside. I want to walk you back through exactly how I got to that door, because the details matter more than the fear did. After I left the front desk with that stolen security log folded in my coat pocket, I did not take the main elevator. I have worked in that building long enough to know every service stairwell, every maintenance corridor, every door that still opens on the old master key. I never bothered to turn in when I stepped back from daily operations. I climbed 4 flights on foot, slow and quiet, my knees reminding me with every step that 68 is not 28 anymore. The executive floor was dark, except for a single strip of light bleeding out from under the door of the smaller conference room, the one we call the glass box, because 3 of its 4 walls are floor-to-ceiling windows overlooking the parking structure. Marcus almost never used that room. He preferred the larger boardroom down the hall, the one with his name already stitched into the leather of the chair at the head of the table, a chair I had given him myself. I approached slowly, keeping close to the wall, the way I used to walk construction sites at night, when I was young enough to still be checking for trespassers myself instead of paying someone else to do it. Through the narrow gap where the door had not quite latched shut, I could see 2 shapes seated across from each other at the small round table inside. One was unmistakably Marcus, his jacket off his sleeves, rolled up the way he does when he is nervous and trying not to show it. The other man I had never seen before in my life. He was older than Marcus, silver at the temples, dressed in a suit that fit him the way expensive suits fit men who have worn nothing else for 30 years. He had a leather portfolio open on the table between them, and he was speaking in the low, even tone of someone who has delivered the same speech to a dozen other nervous men in a dozen other rooms just like this one. I could not hear everything through that narrow gap in the door. Fragments reached me instead, broken pieces of sentences that I would spend the rest of that night trying to piece back together. I heard the words shareholder position mentioned twice. I heard the phrase before the anniversary dinner, which struck me hard because that dinner was still 3 weeks away, and apparently already factored into whatever plan these two men were building between them. Then came the sentence that stopped my breath entirely. The stranger leaned forward, tapped the portfolio once with 2 fingers, and said, quiet but perfectly clear, "He doesn't need to know anything until it's already signed." Marcus did not argue. Marcus did not even flinch. He simply nodded the way a man nods when he has already made peace with a decision he knows he should not be making. I stepped back from that door before either of them could sense my shadow crossing the gap in the light. My hands were steady, which surprised me, because everything else in my chest felt like it had been rearranged in the space of a single sentence. I walked back toward the stairwell the same way I had come, slow and quiet, replaying that voice over and over, trying to place an accent, a cadence, anything that might tell me who exactly had just sat inside my own building discussing my signature like it was already a foregone conclusion. I did not go home that night until nearly midnight. I sat in my car in the parking garage for the better part of an hour, watching the elevator doors through my rearview mirror, waiting to see which one of them would leave first, and whether they would leave together or several minutes apart the way people do when they have decided in advance that they should not be seen walking out side by side. 10 minutes later, the elevator chimed, and the doors opened onto the parking level below me. I watched from behind a concrete pillar as the stranger stepped out alone, still carrying that leather portfolio under his arm, like it weighed more than it should. He walked directly to a silver sedan parked in the far corner of the garage, the kind of car every rental company in this city keeps 100 of on any given day. A small paper tag still hung from the rearview mirror, the kind dealerships never bother to remove before handing the keys to someone who only needs the car for a week. He did not check his phone. He did not look around the garage the way most people do out of habit before getting into a car alone at night. He simply started the engine, backed out in one smooth motion, and drove toward the exit without glancing in my direction, as if he knew exactly how many cameras were working in that garage, and precisely where each of them could see. Marcus came down almost 10 minutes after that, walking slower, checking his phone twice before he reached his own car. He drove toward the house he shares with my daughter, and for a moment, I almost convinced myself that whatever I had just witnessed was a harmless business meeting I did not understand yet. I have built too many deals across too many decades to believe that story for long. I went back up to my office instead of driving home. I keep a leather notebook in my bottom drawer, the same one I have used for 40 years to record exactly one line whenever something changes the shape of a deal I am standing inside. I opened it to a blank page and sat there deciding what to write. I did not have a name yet for the man in the glass box. I only had a sentence and a silence that told me this was only the beginning. The card should not have been warm. That is the detail I could not shake. Paper does not hold heat on its own, not in an empty conference room at 1 a.m, unless a hand had been clutching it only seconds before I stepped through that door. Victor Sloan, Sloan Peak Advisory. 4 words and a title. Strategic Transition Consulting. Printed on stock too plain for a man who had just spent an hour speaking about my company like it already belonged to him. Here's how a piece of paper that small nearly took my breath away. I never made it home that night. After watching Marcus drive off toward the house he shares with my daughter, I climbed back to my office and opened the same leather notebook I have carried through 4 decades of deals, 3 recessions, and 1 flood that nearly drowned this company in its cradle. I stared at a blank page for 20 minutes. Every sentence I tried felt either too frightened or too foolish, and for the first time in my career, I did not trust my own instincts enough to write a single word down. So I went back to the glass box instead. I told myself I only wanted one more look at the room. That was a lie, I told myself, and I knew it the moment the door swung open under my palm. The cleaning crew had not reached that floor yet. 2 paper cups sat abandoned on the round table, coffee gone cold, and skimmed over evidence of a conversation that had ended in a hurry rather than a handshake. I did not touch the cups. I did not touch the chairs. I scanned the floor the way I used to scan a job site the morning after a storm, hunting for the one object that had no business being there. It was wedged beneath the table leg, half hidden, waiting for someone careless enough to leave it behind. I lifted it with the edge of my sleeve instead of my bare fingers, an old habit from years of handling paperwork that mattered more than it looked. I turned it over twice, searching for a phone number, a website, anything else printed on the back. There was nothing. Whoever ordered that card wanted exactly 4 details, reaching a stranger's hand and not one syllable more, which told me more about the man than an entire biography could have. I slid it into my jacket pocket, next to the security log I had already stolen from my own front desk hours earlier, and I drove home a little after 1 in the morning, with 2 pieces of paper riding beside my heartbeat the whole way. Neither one let me sleep. Lying in the dark, I kept circling back to a single sentence, spoken low and even through a gap in a door that had not quite latched. He doesn't need to know anything until it's already signed. 4 words in that sentence belonged to me, and none of them were doesn't. I turned that phrase over the way you turn over a stone, looking for what is crawling underneath it. And every version I imagined ended somewhere worse than the last. Somewhere past 3 in the morning, my mind dragged me back 12 years to the wedding where I first shook Marcus Reyes's hand and decided against every hard lesson 40 years in this business had taught me to trust him anyway. I watched him for months after that, waiting for the seam to show the one thing that would prove he had married my daughter's name instead of my daughter. It never showed. Not once. Not until a conference room lit up past midnight, with a stranger's voice discussing my signature like it was already a formality. By 6, I stopped pretending sleep was coming and made coffee I never drank. I laid the card and the log side by side on my kitchen table, studying them the way I once studied 2 competing bids on the same contract, hunting for the detail that would expose which one was lying and which one was merely quiet. Sloan Peak Advisory meant nothing to me, and in 41 years of this industry, that silence terrified me more than any name I might have recognized. I know every serious firm worth knowing in this state. I also know the names that exist only long enough to serve one purpose before they vanish, and something about the emptiness of that card told me exactly which category it belonged to. At 7:15, I stopped staring and started moving. I picked up the phone and called the one person who has sat across from me in harder rooms than any glass box could ever produce. Diane Foster answered before the first ring finished, her voice already sharp despite the hour, the voice of a woman who has learned that early calls from me are never good news, dressed up as small talk. I did not waste time on pleasantries. I told her to come to my office within the hour and to bring nothing with her except her full attention, because I had found a name, a lie, and a sentence that had followed me home like something with teeth, and I still did not understand how deep any of it went. She did not ask a single question. She simply said, "Give me 40 minutes," and hung up the phone. That is the moment the real search began, though neither of us yet knew how many locked doors it would take us through before we found the one that mattered. Diane Foster read that business card twice before she said a single word out loud. And when she finally looked up at me, her expression was the same one she wore the day we discovered a contractor had forged our insurance documents 20 years ago. "Whatever this is," she said, setting the card down like it might bite her, "it did not come from anyone who wanted to be found." Let me tell you how we got to that moment, sitting across from each other in my office at 8 in the morning, with 2 pieces of paper between us that neither of us fully understood yet. Diane arrived at exactly 7:55, 5 minutes ahead of the hour I had given her, wearing the same gray suit she wears whenever she suspects a meeting will matter more than her calendar suggests. She has been my lawyer for over 20 years, long enough to have earned the right to walk into my office without knocking, and long enough to know that when I call before dawn, I am not calling about a zoning permit. I laid everything out for her exactly as it happened. The phone call where Marcus lied about Dallas, the sealed envelope with its single strange warning, the security log that placed him in this building at the very hour he claimed to be boarding a flight, and finally, the glass box conference room, the stranger's voice, and the 4 words that had followed me home, like something with teeth. He doesn't need to know anything until it's already signed. Diane listened without interrupting once, which told me more than any question she could have asked. When I finished, she picked up the card again, turning it over the same way I had turned it over at my kitchen table hours earlier, searching for something printed on the back that simply was not there. Sloan Peak Advisory. She said more to herself than to me. She pulled out her laptop and opened a business registry search, the kind of database she has taught me to distrust and rely on in equal measure over the years. Within minutes, she had the filing pulled up on the screen between us. The company had been registered only 14 months ago in Delaware, a state where half the businesses that exist on paper have never occupied a single square foot of physical office space in their lives. There was a registered agent listed, a name that meant nothing to either of us, and a post office box instead of a street address. No website, no public client list. No trade publication had ever mentioned the name Sloan Peak Advisory in any context Diane could find in the time it took her coffee to go from too hot to drink to just right. That is not a consulting firm, Diane said, closing the laptop halfway. That is a shell, built to look like one from a distance. And shells like this only get built for a handful of reasons, none of which end well for the man standing on the other side of the deal it is hiding. I asked her what she thought Marcus was on the other side of. She did not answer right away, which was its own kind of answer. Instead, she asked me a question I had not yet let myself ask out loud. Had I noticed anything unusual in the company's recent financials, anything Marcus had handled personally that I had not reviewed line by line the way I once reviewed everything myself before I stepped back from daily operations? I told her the truth. I had not looked closely at anything in months. I had handed him more rope than I realized, trusting 12 years of good behavior to hold the weight of whatever he decided to do with it, while my attention was elsewhere, buried in retirement planning and ribbon cuttings, and an anniversary dinner I had been foolish enough to think was the biggest thing on anyone's mind that month. Diane leaned back in her chair and told me something I have never forgotten and never will. She said that in her 20 years handling corporate law, she had learned that the people who steal quietly from family businesses rarely steal because they are stupid. They steal because they know exactly how much trust they have been given, and they have decided that trust is a resource to spend rather than a debt to repay. Then she told me the part I did not want to hear. A standard internal audit would raise flags the moment anyone started asking questions. And if Marcus had accomplices inside the finance department, an obvious investigation would warn them before we ever found anything worth finding. If we wanted the truth, we would need someone who could look without being seen looking. Someone who operated in the kind of shadows that regular accountants and regular lawyers are trained to stay out of entirely. I sat with that for a long moment, staring at the business card sitting between us on the desk. 4 words and a title, printed for a man who clearly understood exactly how to disappear once his work was finished. I thought about the rules I had followed my entire career, the audits, the disclosures, the careful lines I never crossed, even when crossing them would have been easier. I don't need to play by their rules anymore, I told her, and I meant every word of it. Not when they are already breaking every rule that matters just to take what does not belong to them. Diane studied my face for a moment, then nodded slowly, the way she does when she has decided to follow me somewhere she would normally advise a client against going. "Then I know exactly who to call," she said, and reached for her phone. The number Marcus had borrowed against his own shares was $840,000. And he had done it without a single signature from me, without a single vote from the board, using a clause buried so deep in our shareholder agreement that I had to read it 3 times before I believed my own company's paperwork had ever allowed it. That number came from a man who introduced himself only as Jonas, and who arrived at my office looking like he had walked out of a server room rather than off the street. Diane brought him in less than 2 hours after she picked up her phone that morning. Jonas Vale did not shake hands the way most people do when meeting a client for the first time. He simply nodded once set a laptop case on my conference table and asked me a single question before he agreed to anything. He wanted to know how much I trusted the people currently working in my own finance department. And he wanted an honest answer, not a loyal one. I told him the truth. I trusted them the way a man trusts a bridge he built himself 40 years ago and has not inspected since. Jonas said that was exactly the kind of trust that gets exploited, and then he got to work without waiting for me to feel better about the comparison. He explained his method in plain terms I could actually follow, despite 40 years of my own career spent mostly avoiding computers entirely. He would not touch our internal accounting system directly, not yet, because any direct access request would leave a digital footprint, a timestamp, a record that someone had gone looking. Instead, he would pull banking records through a channel that left no trace on our end, the same way a good private investigator watches a house without ever knocking on the door. By early afternoon, Jonas had something. He turned his laptop toward Diane and me and pointed to a single line buried inside a stack of financial disclosures filed 11 months earlier. Marcus had used his personal shares in Calloway Infrastructure Group as collateral for a private loan, $840,000, routed through a lending group I had never heard of, under a clause in our original shareholder agreement that technically allowed an executive to pledge personal equity without full board disclosure, provided the loan stayed under a certain threshold tied to the company's total valuation. I remember staring at that clause on the screen, a clause I had written myself decades ago, back when the company was small enough that I trusted every signature attached to it completely. I had built a loophole into my own company's foundation, without ever imagining my own son-in-law would be the one to walk through it. Diane leaned forward and asked Jonas where the loan money had gone. He pulled up a second document, a wire transfer log, and traced a portion of that $840,000 directly to an account belonging to Sloan Peak Advisory, labeled in the transfer memo as Strategic Transition Consulting Fees. The exact same phrase printed on the business card still sitting inside my jacket pocket. That is not a coincidence, Diane said quietly, and none of us in that room believed for a second that it was. Jonas kept going, pulling apart the timeline the way I used to pull apart a construction schedule, looking for the one delay that explained every delay after it. The loan had been taken out roughly 10 weeks earlier, right around the same time Marcus had started scheduling closed-door meetings with vendors I had never personally vetted, meetings I had noticed only in passing on his calendar, and dismissed as routine business development. The kind of meetings a vice president is supposed to have, without running every one of them past me first. I asked Jonas the question that had been building in my chest since the moment I saw that number on the screen. Was this legal? He said, technically, yes. Under the letter of a clause I had written myself, Marcus had not broken any law by pledging his own shares. But pledging shares that heavily, that quietly, and routing the proceeds toward a company that did not appear to exist beyond a registered agent and a post office box was not the behavior of a man managing his own investments. It was the behavior of a man preparing to lose something
and making sure he had already been paid before anyone noticed the losing had started.
Diane asked the harder question, the one I had been avoiding since Jonas first opened that file. If Marcus was willing to risk this much of his own equity just to fund whatever Sloan Peak Advisory was actually doing for him, what was the return he expected to be worth that risk? Jonas did not have an answer yet, but he said something that stayed with me for the rest of that day. He said, "Men do not usually mortgage this much of their own future unless they already believe the ground beneath someone else is about to disappear entirely." I sat back in my chair and thought about the anniversary dinner still sitting 3 weeks away on my calendar. The dinner Marcus claimed to be too busy to help plan. And I thought about that voice behind the glass box door, promising someone that I would not need to know anything until it was already signed. Whatever Marcus believed was coming for me, he had already spent $840,000 preparing for its arrival. And I intended to make absolutely certain I understood every part of that plan before he ever got the chance to use it. $50,000 had gone to a doctor's office, and not one appointment on my calendar could explain why. Jonas found it late that same afternoon, buried 3 layers beneath the loan transfers we had already traced to Sloan Peak Advisory. A single wire transfer routed through a secondary account, small compared to the $840,000 we had already uncovered, but strange enough that Jonas circled it twice on his screen before he said a word out loud. Let me walk you back through how a single small number ended up mattering more than the much larger one sitting right beside it. We had been sitting in my office for nearly 6 hours by then. Diane pacing near the window, Jonas hunched over his laptop with the particular stillness of a man who has stopped noticing time passing. He had spent the afternoon mapping every account connected to the loan Marcus had taken against his own shares, following the money the way a man follows a river upstream, looking for the source rather than the mouth. Most of it made a grim kind of sense by that point. Payments to Sloan Peak Advisory, labeled as consulting fees. A handful of smaller transfers to vendors Marcus had scheduled meetings with over the past 10 weeks. Vendors Jonas confirmed had no verifiable business history, no completed projects, nothing beyond a name and a bank account willing to receive money. It painted the picture of a man building something quietly, something he did not want appearing on any report I might casually glance at during a board meeting. Then Jonas found the $50,000 transfer, and the picture stopped making sense in a new and uglier way. It had gone out 3 weeks earlier to an account belonging to a private medical practice, the kind of small, exclusive office that does not advertise and does not take walk-in patients. Jonas pulled the routing information twice to confirm it, because the amount was too specific, too clean to be an accident or an overpayment. $50,000, sent once, with no recurring pattern before or after it. I told him plainly that I had never set foot in that office. I did not recognize the name attached to the practice. I had no appointment, no referral, no reason on earth that a payment tied to my own company's borrowed money should be flowing toward a doctor I had never met. Diane stopped pacing and asked the question that had already started forming in my own chest before she said it out loud. She asked whether Marcus could be secretly ill, whether this was somehow about his own health rather than mine, some private crisis he had hidden from Emily and from all of us out of pride or fear. It was a kind and reasonable question, the kind of question a decent person asks before assuming the worst about someone they have spent 12 years calling family. Jonas did not answer either way. He simply turned the laptop slightly further toward us and pulled up the practice's public registration filing, the kind of basic license information every medical office in this state has to file to legally operate. Whatever specialty this doctor practiced, it was not general medicine, and it was not the kind of specialty a healthy 36-year-old man typically needs $50,000 worth of private, undocumented attention from. I sat with that information for a long moment, turning it over the same way I had turned over that business card at my kitchen table 2 mornings earlier, searching for the angle that made it make sense, and finding nothing except a colder version of the question I had already been asking myself since the glass box conference room. He doesn't need to know anything until it's already signed. Diane finally said the sentence that neither of us had wanted to say first. What if the debt was never the real plan? What if the loan, the shares, the $840,000 we had spent all day tracing was never actually the thing Marcus was building toward at all? What if it was simply the leash, the funding mechanism sitting quietly underneath something else entirely, something that required cash moving in directions nobody was supposed to notice, including a payment to a doctor's office that had absolutely nothing to do with any business Calloway Infrastructure Group has ever been in? I did not answer her right away. I sat there thinking about my own birth date, my own name printed somewhere in a file cabinet, inside an office I had never visited. And I felt something shift in my chest that had nothing to do with anger, and everything to do with a particular kind of dread I had not felt since the early years of this company. Back when a single bad contract could have ended everything I had built before it ever truly started. Jonas closed his laptop halfway and looked at both of us. He said he could keep tracing the money, but tracing money would only tell us where it went, not what it was buying once it arrived. If we wanted to understand what $50,000 had actually purchased at that doctor's office, we were going to need more than bank records. We were going to need to see what that money had been used to create. I told him to get it. Whatever it took, however far outside the ordinary rules of an audit we needed to travel. I wanted to know exactly what that doctor's office had produced in exchange for money that had never come from Marcus's own pocket in the first place. Diane looked at me for a long moment, then nodded once the way she does when she has already decided to follow me somewhere she would normally advise strongly against going. Diane slid the shareholder agreement across my desk and pointed to a clause I had written with my own hand 31 years ago. The same clause Jonas had already flagged, and said 4 words that landed harder than anything Jonas had shown us the day before. You broke your own rule. I did not understand what she meant at first. Not fully. Not until she walked me through exactly how deep the violation went. Let me take you back to that morning. Because by the time Diane said those words, we had already spent nearly 18 hours living inside numbers that kept getting worse the longer we looked at them. She arrived at my office just after 8, carrying a physical copy of our original shareholder agreement, the same document I had not opened in probably a decade. She had spent half the night comparing the clause Marcus had used to pledge his shares against the language I had written back when this company was small enough that every signature still felt personal to me. She laid 2 pages side by side on my desk. One from the original 1994 draft, one from a 2009 amendment I barely remembered approving. The clause was mine, she confirmed, written to give a founding partner flexibility during a cash crunch, back in the years when I sometimes needed to borrow against my own equity just to make payroll on a Friday. I had built it as an escape hatch for myself, never imagining it would someday become a door Marcus could walk through in the opposite direction, away from the company, rather than towards saving it. But the 2009 amendment had added a threshold, a hard limit on how much equity could be pledged without triggering mandatory board disclosure. Marcus's loan sat precisely $4,000 below that threshold, an amount so specific it could not have been an accident. Someone had calculated that number carefully, structured the loan to sit just beneath the line that would have forced this conversation to happen 11 months earlier in a room full of board members, instead of quietly alone in my own office, with only Diane and Jonas beside me. I sat with that for a long moment, staring at a number that had been engineered around my own handwriting from 3 decades ago. I thought about the year I wrote that clause, the winter I nearly lost 3 laborers because I could not make payroll. The nights I spent at a kitchen table, calculating exactly how much of myself I could afford to mortgage before there was nothing left to mortgage at all. I had built that escape hatch out of desperation and humility, and someone had studied it closely enough to turn it into a weapon. Diane confirmed what I already suspected sitting there. Structuring a loan specifically to avoid a disclosure threshold, even one that remains technically legal on paper, is the kind of maneuver that boards do not forgive once they discover it, and shareholders certainly do not forget. It would not put Marcus in handcuffs by itself. It would, however, end any illusion that this had been an innocent financial decision made under ordinary pressure. I asked her the question that mattered more to me than the legal exposure. I asked her why. Why would a man who already had everything, a title he earned, a wife who loved him, a father-in-law who trusted him with more responsibility than most sons ever receive, risk all of it, structuring a secret loan around a threshold from a document he had clearly studied far more carefully than casual curiosity would explain? Diane did not answer that question. Instead, she watched me for a moment and asked one of her own. She asked me to think back to the earliest years of this company, back when I was the only name on every account and every risk, and to remember honestly whether desperation had ever made me consider a shortcut I would have been ashamed to explain out loud to someone I loved. I did not answer her right away either. I thought about those years longer than I wanted to admit. The cold nights, the bank officers who looked at me like I was wasting their time. The version of myself who might have understood exactly what kind of pressure pushes a man toward a threshold engineered $4,000 too clean to be coincidence. That did not excuse what Marcus had done. It only meant I understood for the first time since this began that I was not dealing with a stupid man making a careless mistake. I was dealing with someone patient enough to read 30-year-old paperwork closely enough to find the exact seam I had left in it, and disciplined enough to structure a fraud so quietly that an ordinary audit would have sailed right past it without a single flag raised. I told Diane we were not ready to act yet. Confronting Marcus with the loan alone would only close the one advantage we still had, the advantage of him believing nobody was watching closely enough to notice. Whatever this loan had been used to build, whatever that $50,000 payment to a doctor's office had purchased, I wanted to see the entire structure standing in daylight before I touched a single piece of it. Diane agreed, though I could see in her face that patience was costing her something too. We were no longer just examining a lie. We were now certain there was an architect standing somewhere behind it, and neither of us yet knew how far his blueprint actually reached. Jonas said something that afternoon that I have not been able to shake since. He said men who are drowning do not usually have time to also be this organized. We were 3 days into the investigation by then, and the deeper we dug, the less this looked like a son-in-law making one desperate mistake, and the more it looked like a man following someone else's careful instructions. Let me walk you through exactly what convinced all three of us of that. Jonas had spent the previous night mapping every meeting on Marcus's calendar, going back 4 months, cross-referencing them against the timeline of the loan, the payments to Sloan Peak Advisory, and that $50,000 transfer to the doctor's office none of us could yet explain. He laid the pattern out across my conference table the next morning, like a man laying out a crime scene rather than a spreadsheet. And once I saw it arranged that way, I understood why he had barely slept. Every closed-door meeting Marcus had scheduled over those 4 months followed the same rhythm. A meeting with an unfamiliar vendor, always brief, always logged under a vague label like strategic review or partnership discussion. Within 48 hours of nearly every one of those meetings, a small transfer would move through an account connected to the loan. Not large amounts individually, small enough that any one of them examined alone would look like ordinary operating friction, the kind of minor expense a busy executive barely notices signing off on. But arranged together, The pattern had a shape to it, and the shape was not the shape of a man improvising under pressure. It was the shape of someone executing a checklist, one item at a time, in an order that had clearly been decided before the first item was ever crossed off. Diane asked the question Jonas and I had both been circling without saying out loud. She asked whether it was possible Marcus had built this checklist himself out of his own desperation, without anyone guiding his hand. Jonas considered it seriously before he answered, because he is not a man who dismisses a simpler explanation just because a more dramatic one is more interesting. He said it was possible, but unlikely for one specific reason. The clause Marcus had used to structure his loan below the disclosure threshold required knowledge of a 30-year-old amendment buried inside a document most executives never read past the first 10 pages of. Marcus had access to that document, certainly, but accessing a document and knowing exactly which 4 sentences inside it mattered enough to build a fraud around are two very different kinds of knowledge. One is a matter of opportunity. The other is a matter of expertise. Marcus had never displayed in 12 years of working alongside me. I thought back to the man in the glass box conference room, the stranger with silver at his temples and a leather portfolio that looked like it had crossed 100 tables, just like mine, before it ever reached this one. I thought about the voice that had said, quiet and even, that I would not need to know anything until it was already signed. A sentence spoken with the confidence of someone who had said very similar sentences before, in other rooms, to other nervous men sitting across other small round tables. Diane voiced the thought before I fully finished forming it myself. She said that Sloan Peak Advisory did not read like a consulting firm hired to help Marcus navigate a difficult decision. It read like a firm built specifically to walk a series of clients through the exact same difficult decision over and over, refining the process a little further each time it was used. The way any real business refines a service it sells repeatedly. That thought sat heavy in the room for a long moment. If she was right, Marcus was not the architect of whatever was being built around me. He was a client. He was someone else's opportunity, walked carefully through a process that had likely been walked with other families, other companies, other fathers who had once trusted a son-in-law or a nephew or a business partner, exactly the way I had trusted Marcus for 12 quiet, comfortable years. I asked Jonas directly whether he could find out if Sloan Peak Advisory had done this kind of work before, whether there was a pattern stretching back further than the 14 months since it was registered in Delaware. He said the shell company itself would not tell us that, since shells are built precisely to avoid leaving that kind of trail behind. But the man who kept appearing behind it, the stranger from the glass box, the silver-haired man with the leather portfolio, he was a person, not a piece of paper. And people leave traces that paper never does. Names, old employers, photographs at conferences nobody thought to make private. Jonas closed his laptop and looked at both of us with an expression I had not seen from him yet, something close to genuine unease. He said finding out who that man really was would take time, we might not have much of, given how quickly everything else around us seemed to already be moving. I told him to find it anyway, because I had a feeling sitting there in my own office, surrounded by numbers that no longer made sense, as one man's desperate mistake, that whoever was standing behind Marcus was the only person in this story who actually understood the whole shape of what was coming for me. The document was titled Neurocognitive Assessment, and my name was on the very first line, followed by a birth date that was mine, and a diagnosis I had never once heard from any doctor in my entire life. Early stage progressive cognitive decline, moderate severity, projected to worsen over the next 18 months. Jonas found it at 11 that night, and none of us said a word for almost a full minute after he turned the screen toward me and let it sit there, glowing in the dark of my own office. Let me walk you through exactly how that file ended up open on a laptop in my own office. Because the path to finding it mattered almost as much as the document itself did, once we finally read it in full. After days of chasing a stranger who left almost no trace behind him, Jonas had shifted his focus back toward the $50,000 payment, the one piece of this entire puzzle that had a physical address attached to it, rather than a shell company hiding behind a post office box. He explained to Diane and me that shell companies and silver-haired strangers were difficult to trace quickly. But a licensed medical practice, however private and however carefully guarded, still had to exist somewhere inside a system of records, billing codes and digital correspondence that even careful people occasionally forget to fully protect from someone patient enough to look. He had spent 2 full days working through what he called the outer layer publicly available filings, professional licensing boards, malpractice insurance records that occasionally listed a physician's affiliated practices and referral networks. That work eventually led him to a name, Dr. Neil Ashford, a neurologist with a small private practice on the north side of the city, a man who accepted no walk-in patients and advertised nowhere at all. The exact kind of quiet, discreet office that wealthy families use when they want a diagnosis handled quietly, away from public record and away from casual scrutiny. What Jonas found inside Dr. Ashford's digital correspondence, once he finally located a way in, was not something he could have predicted even an hour earlier. An email chain several months old between an account registered to Dr. Ashford and an address that traced back through 2 separate layers of forwarding directly to Marcus's personal accounts. The subject line of the earliest message in that chain read simply, "Regarding the arrangement." Discussed nothing more specific than that, though the vagueness itself felt deliberate once we understood what followed it. Diane read that entire email chain twice before she said a single word out loud. The same way I had read the fake death certificate sitting inside that folder weeks earlier, twice. As though repetition alone might somehow change what the words actually said. The second time through, the emails discussed in language careful enough to avoid stating anything too plainly for an outside reader, a documentation package that would need to reflect a very specific clinical picture. One consistent with early cognitive impairment, sufficient to support what one particular message called a transition of executive responsibilities within the company. Attached to the final message in that chain was the document now sitting open on the screen directly in front of me. My full legal name, my correct birth date, a social security number that I confirmed, with a cold feeling spreading slowly through my chest, was actually mine, and not some approximation of it. Fabricated results from cognitive testing I had never once taken in my life. A section describing memory lapses I had never experienced. Confusion I had never once displayed to anyone. Patterns of behavior that read like a stranger's fiction written about a man who happened to share my name and nothing else about him at all. I sat there staring at my own signature at the bottom of that page. A signature I had never signed myself, rendered close enough to convince anyone who was not looking specifically for the small, deliberate imperfections I know exist in my own handwriting after 68 years of using it, every single day of my working life. Jonas explained what he believed the document was ultimately meant to accomplish, based entirely on the language surrounding it in those earlier emails. A formal diagnosis like this one, issued by a licensed physician and properly filed with the right people, could be used to support a legal petition, the kind that argues an individual is no longer capable of managing his own business affairs responsibly. He said companies our size almost always carry some version of a clause allowing for an emergency transfer of executive authority in exactly this kind of scenario. a clause meant to protect a business if its leader genuinely, tragically, becomes incapacitated through no fault of his own. I felt the floor shift slightly beneath that particular sentence, because I already knew, without needing to check a single file, that Calloway Infrastructure Group carried exactly that kind of clause written into its own founding bylaws. I had written it myself decades earlier, during the very same period I wrote the shareholder pledge clause Marcus had already exploited. Back when I was young enough to believe every protective measure I built into this company would only ever be used to protect it. Never once imagined it would be turned into a weapon against me. Diane said quietly that this changed everything about how we needed to move forward from that point on. This was no longer simply a matter of an employee mismanaging funds or structuring a loan around a convenient technicality. This was the deliberate manufacture of false medical evidence created for the specific purpose of stripping a company founder of his authority, using a legal mechanism he had built with his own two hands to protect the very thing now being turned directly against him. I thought about the anniversary dinner still sitting on my calendar, less than 3 weeks away by that point, and about the voice in the glass box promising someone that I would not need to know anything until it was already signed. I understood now, sitting in the quiet of my office, with a fabricated diagnosis glowing on the screen in front of me, exactly what that sentence had actually meant all along, and exactly how close it had already come to becoming true. Whatever timeline Marcus and the man behind Sloan Peak Advisory were working from, we had just found the one document that told us plainly they were never planning to ask my permission for any part of it. Let them think it's working. That was the sentence I said out loud at nearly midnight, and the moment it left my mouth, Diane looked at me like I had just changed the entire shape of this fight without asking her permission first. I had spent the previous hour reading and rereading the fabricated diagnosis, sitting on Jonas's laptop. And somewhere in that hour, the fear I had been carrying since the glass box conference room finally turned into something colder and far more useful. Let me explain exactly what shifted in my thinking, because it did not happen all at once. Diane had pulled up our company's founding bylaws alongside the fabricated medical file, searching for the exact clause Jonas suspected this entire scheme was built to trigger. She found it on page 41, a section I had written 34 years ago, titled Emergency Executive Incapacity Provision. In plain language, it stated that if the founder and controlling executive of Calloway Infrastructure Group was formally diagnosed by a licensed physician with a condition rendering him unable to manage business affairs, the vice president could petition the board for an immediate, legally binding transfer of executive authority, pending only a majority board vote. I remembered writing that clause vividly, sitting at my kitchen table the year my own father was diagnosed with a stroke that left him unable to run his small trucking company, watching two of his business partners fight for 8 brutal months over who had the legal right to make decisions on his behalf, while he lay in a hospital bed, unable to speak for himself. I had built that provision to prevent exactly that kind of chaos from ever happening to the people who worked for me, never imagining that the very mechanism designed to protect this company during a genuine crisis would someday be aimed at me by someone manufacturing a crisis that did not exist. Diane confirmed what all 3 of us already suspected sitting in that room. Marcus did not need to seize control of Calloway Infrastructure Group through theft or coercion, or any method that would obviously look like a hostile takeover to the outside world. He simply needed one signed diagnosis filed correctly, presented convincingly to a board of directors who had known him for 12 years and had no obvious reason to doubt either his sincerity or the medical credentials behind the document he was holding. Jonas added the detail that turned my stomach further. He had found a calendar entry buried inside Marcus's own scheduling software for a board meeting request submitted just 2 days after that fabricated diagnosis was completed. The meeting request cited in careful formal language an urgent matter regarding executive continuity planning. It did not mention my name directly. It did not need to. I sat there for a long while, turning the shape of it over in my mind, the same way I once turned over blueprints, looking for a structural flaw before pouring a single foundation. Marcus was not planning to fight me. He was planning to grieve me, publicly, sympathetically, in front of a room full of people who had watched him work loyally beside me for over a decade, using a document with my name on it that made resistance from me look exactly like the confusion the diagnosis predicted I would eventually show. That realization is what led me to the sentence I said to Diane and Jonas near midnight. If Marcus and whoever stood behind Sloan Peak Advisory wanted a confused, declining old man walking into a board meeting, unable to clearly defend himself, then perhaps the wisest thing I could do was let them believe for a little while longer that they were watching exactly that. Diane did not like the idea at first. She argued reasonably that the moment we had this much evidence, we had every right to move immediately to confront Marcus, to bring in outside counsel to end this before it went any further. I understood her instinct completely, because it had been my instinct too for the better part of that hour. But I had spent 4 decades in rooms where the person who reacted first usually lost the most. If I confronted Marcus now, armed only with what we currently had, he would have time to destroy correspondence coach Dr. Ashford into silence and quietly restructure whatever remained of his plan before we ever reached a board meeting. Worse, we still did not know who the silver-haired man from the glass box truly was, or how many other pieces of this plan remained hidden from us entirely. I told Diane and Jonas that I wanted to understand the full shape of this scheme before I ever moved to dismantle a single piece of it. I wanted to know how deep Sloan Peak Advisory's involvement truly went, who else might be connected to it, and exactly when Marcus intended to use that fabricated diagnosis. Only then would I know precisely where to strike, and how to make certain that when this finally ended, it ended completely. Not with a quiet settlement and a resignation letter, but with every person responsible fully and permanently exposed. Jonas closed his laptop slowly and nodded the first real approval I had seen on his face since this began. Diane exhaled, clearly still uneasy, but she did not argue further. Whatever this had started as a father's suspicion about a missed dinner and a lie about Dallas, it had become something else entirely now. And for the first time since that envelope arrived, addressed to a piece of furniture in my office, I finally understood exactly what game I was actually playing. Marcus signed nothing that afternoon, but he shook my hand twice. Once when I made the offer, and once again on his way out the door. As if a second handshake might somehow make $15 million feel more real than it already did. I want to tell you exactly what I offered him, and exactly why I offered it. Because that handshake was the moment I stopped defending myself and started building the trap that would eventually close around him. 3 days after we decided to let Marcus believe his plan was working, I called him into my office under the simplest pretense I could think of, a routine conversation about a new commercial development site in the northern suburbs. 42 acres, zoned for retail and residential use, sitting on prime land near a growing transit corridor that every serious developer in this city had already noticed. It was the kind of acquisition Calloway Infrastructure Group would ordinarily absorb without a second thought, the kind of deal I would have closed in a single meeting a decade earlier. I told Marcus I did not want the company to hold this particular asset. I told him I wanted him to hold it personally, under his own newly formed limited liability company, with Calloway Infrastructure Group guaranteeing the acquisition loan behind him. I framed it exactly the way I knew would land hardest with a man already convinced I was losing my grip on the details that mattered most. I told him my instincts were not what they used to be, that I was terrified of making a catastrophic error that could damage the company everyone at that table depended on for their livelihoods, and that separating this asset from the main portfolio
would protect Calloway Infrastructure Group from any mistake my supposedly declining judgment might eventually cause down the road.
I watched his face closely while I said it, tracking every flicker of expression the way I once tracked a competitor's face across a negotiating table decades earlier. Greed and caution collided visibly behind his eyes for a moment, exactly the way Diane had predicted they would the night before. He asked, reasonably enough on the surface, why I wanted the property held independently rather than absorbed into the existing portfolio, the way every other acquisition of this size had been handled for 4 decades straight. I gave him the answer Diane and I had rehearsed the night before, word for word, until it sounded natural instead of practiced. I told him that if my condition worsened the way the doctors apparently expected it to, I did not want a personal lapse in judgment threatening an asset this valuable to our family's future. Holding it separately under his own company, with our guarantee standing behind the financing, meant he would not risk a single dollar of his own capital, while still capturing the full upside once the development eventually launched. I called it an early inheritance, offered while I still had the clarity remaining to offer it properly and generously. The bait was, as Diane later described it, privately, embarrassingly effective on a man that eager. Marcus accepted within minutes, promising to have his attorney begin the incorporation paperwork immediately that same week. He thanked me with a warmth that might have genuinely moved me 2 months earlier, before a stranger's voice through a half-closed conference room door had taught me exactly how little that particular warmth was actually worth to him. Emily was in the room for part of that conversation, seated quietly near the window, and her reaction told me something Marcus's eager signature never could have told me on its own. She did not celebrate the way a woman might be expected to celebrate her family's sudden good fortune. She watched her husband accept an enormous financial gift from her supposedly failing father, and her expression carried none of the relief I would have expected from someone who believed her family's future had just been permanently secured overnight. She asked me once, carefully, almost cautiously, whether I was certain about the structure of the deal, whether I had discussed every clause thoroughly with Diane before offering it to him. It was a small question, easy enough to dismiss in the moment, but it stayed with me long after Marcus had already left the room, composing a celebratory phone call to someone waiting for him out in the hallway. After they left, Diane and I sat together, with the signed term sheet resting between us on the desk. The very first physical piece of paper Marcus had committed to since this entire scheme against me had quietly begun. She reminded me what this simple-looking document actually accomplished beneath its generous surface. By accepting the guarantee structure exactly as I had offered it to him, Marcus was now legally binding his own personal company to a $15 million obligation, one that Calloway Infrastructure Group would only ever honor under conditions we controlled completely. Conditions Marcus had not bothered reading closely, because greed and urgency rarely leave much room for careful, patient reading. Diane asked whether I felt any hesitation handing him something this large, even purely as bait for a trap neither of us had finished building yet. I told her the truth honestly. I felt none at all, not anymore. Not after reading my own fabricated diagnosis with my own real signature forged carefully beneath it. Whatever guilt I might once have carried about quietly deceiving my own son-in-law had already been spent completely, the moment I understood exactly what he was already willing to do to me. First, without a single moment of hesitation of his own. What none of us could have predicted yet was how quickly Marcus would move once he believed the asset truly belonged to him, or how carelessly he and the people quietly advising him would handle the very structure I had built specifically to be handled that carelessly. Jonas played the recording twice before either Diane or I said a single word. And on the second listen, one sentence from the man calling himself Victor Sloan made the hair on the back of my neck stand up
in a way numbers on a spreadsheet never had.
Let me explain exactly how that recording ended up sitting on my desk, only 4 days after Marcus walked out of my office, clutching a $15 million term sheet like it was already cash in his hands. Jonas had kept his surveillance running quietly in the background this entire time. The same careful, undetectable monitoring he had used to trace the loan and the medical file, never touching anything that would leave a trace on Marcus's end. 2 nights after the signing, a call came through on a line Jonas had flagged weeks earlier. A burner number that connected briefly to Marcus's personal cell before disconnecting entirely. The kind of number a careful man uses exactly once and then discards for good. The call lasted 11 minutes. Jonas isolated the audio and cleaned it enough that every word came through clearly by the time he brought it to us the following morning. Marcus opened the conversation sounding almost giddy, describing the signed term sheet, the guarantee structure, the fact that his father-in-law had personally offered to shoulder the financial risk of the entire acquisition on his behalf. He sounded for the first time in weeks like a man who believed he had finally won something enormous and permanent. The voice on the other end of that call was unmistakably the same one I had heard through the gap in the glass box conference room door weeks earlier. Calm, measured, entirely unimpressed by good news that had clearly excited Marcus far more than it excited him. Sloan told Marcus that involving Calloway Infrastructure Group as a guarantor on paper was a mistake, not a gift at all. He explained in language far too fluent and far too specific for casual conversation that any guarantee tied to the parent company would eventually require board-level financial review, standard due diligence that any competent audit committee would perform automatically before honoring an obligation that large. Diane paused the recording there and looked at me carefully. That is not something an outside financial consultant typically knows off the top of his head, she said. That is something someone with direct experience inside corporate governance structures would know. The kind of knowledge that comes from having sat on the other side of exactly this kind of review process many times before. Not from advising small business owners about cash flow. We let the recording continue playing. Sloan instructed Marcus to restructure the deal entirely, cutting Calloway Infrastructure Group out of the guarantee altogether and completely. He suggested leveraging the equity in the home I knew Marcus and Emily owned outright, along with using Sloan Peak Advisory itself as a secondary guarantor, since the shell company's fabricated consulting revenue, built entirely from the fraudulent payments already flowing out of my own company, would appear on paper as a financially healthy, cash-rich enterprise capable of backing a substantial loan of that size. Marcus hesitated on the recording, asking the obvious question that any nervous man would ask in that position. He asked how they could possibly secure a loan of that size without the weight of Calloway Infrastructure Group's credit standing behind it. Sloan's answer was the sentence that stopped all 3 of us cold in my office that night, one I have not been able to forget since. He said, almost dismissively, that private lenders rarely look past collateral and cash flow projections when the numbers on paper already tell the story a borrower wants told, and that he had, quote, walked clients through structures exactly like this one, more times than Marcus needed to know about. More times than Marcus needed to know about. Diane repeated that phrase back, slowly, letting it settle heavily in the room around us. That was not the sentence of a first-time consultant helping one nervous client solve one unusual problem quietly. That was the sentence of someone who had run this exact playbook before, possibly many times over, refining the language, the timing, and the specific vulnerabilities to exploit with each repetition, the way any experienced professional refines a process they perform regularly, rather than improvising one entirely from nothing. I thought again about the leather portfolio Sloan had carried into that glass box conference room weeks earlier, thick enough to hold far more than a single client's paperwork could ever require.
I thought about how effortlessly he had discussed board-level financial review, corporate guarantee structures, and private lending mechanics, subjects that require years spent inside actual boardrooms to understand fluently, rather than months of general business consulting experience gathered from the outside looking in.
Jonas said what all three of us were already thinking, without wanting to say it out loud first. Whoever this man truly was, he had far more specific expertise in exactly the kind of corporate structure Calloway Infrastructure Group represented than any independent consultant running a 14-month-old shell company out of a post office box in Delaware had any reasonable business possessing. Someone with that level of fluency in board governance and institutional lending had almost certainly worked inside a company our size before, not merely advised beside one as an outside consultant hired for a single project. I sat with that recording playing back once more in my mind, long after Jonas had already shut his laptop for the night and gone quiet himself. Marcus believed he was being guided by a clever, discreet advisor, helping him quietly protect a sudden windfall. What I had just heard sounded like something else entirely. A man executing a familiar strategy against a familiar type of target, speaking with the easy confidence of someone who had done this before, and who clearly expected to walk away from it exactly as cleanly as he apparently always had in the past. Victor Sloan was not his real name. And the moment Jonas said that out loud, I understood we were no longer investigating a single betrayal inside my own family. We were staring at something considerably larger, something that had clearly been done before, to someone else long before it was ever done to me. Let me walk you through exactly what Jonas found, and how quickly the ground beneath this entire investigation shifted once he found it. It took Jonas nearly 3 full days to get past the wall of anonymity Sloan had built around himself. 3 days of tracing conference attendee lists, old professional licensing records, and photographs from industry events that nobody had ever bothered to make private. He explained to Diane and me that shell companies are easy to hide behind, but faces are not. Not once you know which decade of photographs to start searching through. He found the match in a photograph nearly 9 years old, taken at a mid-sized corporate development conference in Chicago. The man standing at a podium, silver already at his temples even then, was identified in the caption as a senior director of business development for a company called Ashcroft Sterling Group, a private equity and acquisitions firm with a long, quiet history of buying up mid-sized family-owned businesses, almost always under circumstances that looked from the outside like unfortunate accidents rather than deliberate campaigns. I had heard the name Ashcroft Sterling before, though only in passing, the way you hear about a storm that hit a neighboring county rather than your own. They had a reputation in commercial real estate and infrastructure circles. A reputation built quietly over almost 2 decades for identifying founder-led companies experiencing some kind of internal instability, a health crisis, a messy succession dispute, a sudden leadership vacuum, and moving in fast with acquisition offers structured to look generous on paper while actually exploiting exactly the desperation the instability had created. Jonas pulled the man's actual name from an old employment record buried in a state licensing database. Sloan had left Ashcroft Sterling roughly 5 years earlier, at least officially. His public employment history simply stopped there. No new employer listed anywhere. No further professional licenses filed under his real name. 14 months later, Sloan Peak Advisory was registered in Delaware, and Victor Sloan, whatever his birth certificate actually said, began appearing in glass box conference rooms belonging to men like me. Diane asked the question that mattered most once Jonas laid all of this out. She asked whether Ashcroft Sterling still had any active financial connection to him now, or whether he had simply borrowed their old playbook and gone into this business for himself once he left the firm. Jonas had already anticipated the question. He pulled up a separate document,
a record of secondary market debt purchases, the kind of quiet financial transaction that almost never appears on the front page of anything. Over the past 7 months, a holding entity connected through 2 additional shell layers back to Ashcroft Sterling Group had been quietly purchasing small tranches of outstanding debt, originally issued to several of our smaller regional subcontractors. Debt that Calloway Infrastructure Group had co-signed years earlier as a standard courtesy to help those smaller partners secure better financing terms. None of it was illegal. None of it by itself was even unusual. But collected together, it meant that Ashcroft Sterling now quietly held leverage over several financial relationships connected to my company. Leverage they had been accumulating patiently, piece by piece, for months before Marcus ever sat down across a table from Victor Sloan in that glass box conference room. I sat with that information longer than I sat with almost anything else we had uncovered so far. This was not a son-in-law's desperate, isolated betrayal anymore. This was a company, a large and disciplined one, that had identified Calloway Infrastructure Group as a target, found the one weak seam running through my own family, and begun carefully, patiently exploiting it. Using a man skilled enough to make an eager, indebted vice president believe every step of the plan was entirely his own idea. Diane said what I had already started to understand myself. If Ashcroft Sterling succeeded in getting me declared incapacitated and Marcus installed as controlling executive while he was already drowning in debt and legally bound to Sloan Peak Advisory's fraudulent guarantee structure, Marcus would be in no position to negotiate anything on the company's behalf. He would be desperate, compromised, and entirely dependent on whatever terms Ashcroft Sterling chose to offer for what would functionally become a forced, discounted acquisition of everything I had spent 41 years building. Jonas added one final detail that made the entire shape of it click into place. He said Ashcroft Sterling Group had a board meeting of their own, scheduled in exactly 11 days. A quarterly review where major new acquisition targets were typically formally presented to their investment committee for approval. Whatever timeline Marcus believed he was working toward, someone above Sloan almost certainly wanted this entire matter resolved and presentable before that date arrived. I looked at Diane, then at Jonas, and told them both the same thing I had been telling myself since the moment that name appeared on the screen. We were no longer simply defending a family business from one desperate man's mistake. We were defending it from a company that had done this before successfully to other families who likely never saw it coming until it was already too late to stop. 4 days. That was the number Diane read off the calendar invitation that had just landed in my inbox. An invitation I had not sent, for a board meeting I had not scheduled. Titled simply, Executive Continuity Matter. Urgent. I stared at that subject line for a long moment before I said anything at all. Because 4 days suddenly felt like an impossibly short distance between the man I still was and the man Marcus intended to convince an entire board of directors I had already become. Let me explain exactly how we arrived at that number, and why it changed the entire pace of everything we had been doing until that point. Jonas had continued monitoring communications quietly in the background, even after identifying Ashcroft Sterling's involvement. And that morning, a scheduling confirmation had gone out from Marcus's assistant to 11 members of our board of directors, along with a request that Dr. Neil Ashford's office be prepared to provide supporting documentation upon request. The meeting had been set for the following Thursday at 10 in the morning in our main boardroom, rather than the smaller glass box conference room where all of this had quietly begun weeks earlier. A detail that felt deliberate the moment Diane pointed it out to me. Diane read the invitation twice, the same careful way she reads every document that matters, and then set her tablet down on my desk, with a stillness that told me she had already started calculating everything that needed to happen before that Thursday arrived. She said the timing made sense once you considered what Jonas had found about Ashcroft Sterling's own quarterly investment review, scheduled 11 days out. Marcus needed this matter resolved, voted on, and legally finalized well before that date, so that whatever offer Ashcroft Sterling intended to present to their own investment committee would already have a controlling, compromised executive in place at Calloway Infrastructure Group, ready to accept terms a healthy, alert founder never would agree to on his own. I sat with the weight of that timeline settling into my chest, slowly. The way cold water settles into a boot you did not notice was already leaking. 4 days was enough time to finish preparing evidence, but it was not enough time to feel entirely comfortable about how thin the margin between preparation and disaster had suddenly become, or how many small mistakes we could still afford to make before Thursday morning arrived. Jonas spoke first, laying out exactly what we still needed before that meeting. We had the fabricated diagnosis and the email chain connecting it to Dr. Ashford. We had the recorded phone call between Marcus and Sloan discussing the restructured guarantee. We had documentation tracing Sloan's real identity back to Ashcroft Sterling Group, along with evidence of the quiet debt purchases connected to several of our subcontractors. What we did not yet have was anything that would hold up cleanly and immediately in front of 11 board members who had known Marcus personally for over a decade, several of whom had personally watched him grow from an eager young project coordinator into a trusted vice president under my own direct mentorship year after year. Diane explained the problem plainly, the way she always does when she wants me to actually hear it, rather than simply agree with it. Recordings and financial trails are powerful, she said, but boards move cautiously, especially when the accusation on the table involves a founder's own son-in-law and a licensed physician's signed medical opinion. If we simply walked into that meeting Thursday morning and presented everything we had uncovered, without a careful plan for how to sequence it, Marcus's legal counsel could argue we had assembled an elaborate theory built entirely from private surveillance, rather than solid, independently admissible proof. And the board might hesitate long enough for real, permanent damage to occur, regardless of how the eventual vote went. I asked her what would actually settle this beyond doubt in the eyes of 11 cautious people sitting around that table. She was quiet for a moment before answering. She said the single most powerful piece of evidence we did not yet have was a direct corroborating statement from Dr. Ashford himself, something that went beyond emails and financial records, something a physician would only provide once he understood exactly how much legal exposure he was personally facing by continuing to protect Marcus and Sloan instead of protecting his own license and his own freedom. Jonas agreed immediately, adding that a licensed physician facing potential fraud and conspiracy charges typically has far more to lose than a well-insulated shell company or a private equity director operating 3 careful layers removed from his own signature on anything. If we could reach Ashford before Thursday, quietly and carefully, offering him a clear picture of exactly how much trouble he was already standing in, there was a real possibility he would choose to protect himself rather than continue protecting people who had never once, in any communication Jonas had recovered, expressed the slightest concern for what eventually happened to him personally once this scheme was finished being used. I told Diane to reach out to Ashford directly, through whatever careful legal channel she believed would frighten him accurately, without tipping off Marcus or Sloan in the process. 4 days was not much time to turn a frightened man into a cooperating witness, but I had learned enough about fear across 4 decades in business to know that the right kind of pressure applied at exactly the right moment could accomplish in a single afternoon what months of patient investigation sometimes never could. Whatever Thursday morning ended up looking like, I intended to walk into that boardroom holding something Marcus and Sloane had never once considered when they built this entire plan around one simple assumption: that I would arrive there alone, confused, and completely unable to defend myself. Dr. Neil Ashford's hands were shaking so badly he could not get his own office key into the lock. And Diane told me later that she almost felt sorry for him, right up until she remembered exactly whose name he had forged. Let me walk you through how we got a frightened physician standing outside his own darkened office at 7 in the morning, and why that fear turned out to be the single most valuable thing we found in this entire investigation. Diane had spent the previous evening preparing carefully for this exact conversation, reviewing federal statutes on medical fraud, conspiracy, and falsification of records, with a specialist colleague she trusted completely, someone who owed her a favor significant enough to work through the night without asking too many questions about why. She wanted to walk into Ashford's office not with threats, but with an accurate, devastating picture of exactly how much criminal exposure he already carried, delivered calmly enough that fear would work in our favor rather than making him defensive or reckless. She arrived at his practice before his first scheduled appointment, waiting in the parking lot, until she saw him pull in alone. She approached him in the hallway before he had even unlocked the door, introduced herself plainly as legal counsel for Calloway Infrastructure Group, and asked for 15 minutes of his time regarding a matter she described only as extremely serious and entirely private. She told me afterward that his reaction told her everything before she said another word. He did not ask what the matter was about. He simply went pale and asked her to come inside. Diane laid it out for him methodically once they were seated, the way she lays out any argument she intends to win completely. She told him we possessed the fabricated diagnosis bearing my name, the complete email chain between his office and Marcus discussing what they had carefully called the arrangement, and financial records tracing a $50,000 payment directly into an account under his control. She told him plainly that falsifying a medical record to support fraudulent removal of executive authority carried federal exposure far beyond a simple licensing complaint. Exposure that included conspiracy charges and potential prison time measured in years rather than months. Ashford, she said, sat in complete silence for almost a full minute before he spoke. When he finally did, his first question was not about Marcus or Sloane at all. He asked whether Diane could guarantee any protection for him personally if he cooperated fully with whatever we were building. Diane told him honestly that she could not guarantee anything alone, but that a physician who came forward voluntarily before charges were filed, with a complete and truthful account, stood in an entirely different legal position than one who was later caught and forced to explain himself after the fact. That distinction, she told me, was what finally broke him. Ashford admitted quietly, and without much resistance left in him, that Marcus had approached him nearly 4 months earlier through an introduction arranged by Sloane, describing the $50,000 payment as compensation for what Sloane had called a routine documentation service. Standard practice, he claimed, for family businesses managing sensitive succession planning quietly and discreetly. Ashford insisted he had told himself at the time that he was simply helping a family avoid an uncomfortable public conversation, a lie he admitted almost immediately after saying it out loud that he had never fully believed, even while telling it to himself. He agreed before Diane left his office that morning to provide a complete sworn statement detailing the arrangement, along with copies of every piece of correspondence in his possession, connecting him to both Marcus and Sloane. More importantly, he agreed to appear in person if necessary, understanding that his continued silence protected people who had shown no interest whatsoever in protecting him once this arrangement finally came apart. Exactly the outcome Jonas had predicted. Days earlier, when he first suggested this approach.
Diane called me from her car in the parking lot immediately afterward. Her voice carrying a controlled satisfaction I had not heard from her since this entire ordeal began weeks earlier. She told me we finally had exactly what we needed: a witness willing to speak plainly about intent. Not just financial trails and recorded phone calls that a skilled attorney might still find ways to argue around in front of a hesitant board. I sat with that news for a long moment after she hung up, thinking about how close this entire scheme had come to succeeding, purely on the strength of paperwork and silence. Every piece of it, the fabricated diagnosis, the restructured loan, the quiet debt purchases, had depended entirely on nobody involved ever being asked directly, under real pressure, to explain themselves honestly. The moment someone did ask, plainly and seriously, the entire structure had begun collapsing. In less than 15 minutes inside a darkened medical office, before the first patient of the day had even arrived, Jonas spent the remainder of that day organizing everything we now had into a single clear timeline, cross-referenced against Ashford's statement, ready to be presented in whatever order would land hardest in front of a board that had known Marcus far longer than they had known the truth sitting quietly behind him. Thursday was now 2 days away, and for the first time since that envelope had arrived, addressed to a piece of furniture in my own office, I finally believed we were prepared to walk into that boardroom holding something Marcus could not talk his way around. "Dad, I need to tell you something before Thursday." Emily's voice cracked on the word Thursday, and then the line went dead before I could say a single word back to her. I stood in my kitchen, holding a silent phone for nearly a full minute afterward, staring at the screen, waiting for it to ring again. And it did not. Let me tell you exactly what led up to that call, because the 2 days leading into it had already been strange in ways I did not fully understand until much later. It began the previous afternoon, when Emily stopped by my office unannounced, something she rarely did anymore, now that her visits usually came bundled together with Marcus and some piece of business he wanted to discuss. She sat across from my desk for nearly 20 minutes without bringing up anything specific at all, asking instead about small, ordinary things, whether I was sleeping well, whether I had been eating properly, whether I remembered the trip we took to the coast the summer she turned 16. I remember thinking at the time that she was checking on me the way people check on someone they have been told is declining, gently, carefully watching for signs rather than asking for them directly. I played my part exactly as Diane and I had planned. Tired but pleasant, occasionally losing the thread of a sentence before catching it again. Careful never to overplay the performance in front of my own daughter, the way I had allowed myself to overplay it slightly in front of Marcus. Something about deceiving Emily, even in the smallest, most necessary way, sat differently in my chest than deceiving her husband ever had. And I noticed that difference more than once that afternoon. Near the end of that visit, she asked me directly whether I trusted Marcus completely. It was not the kind of question she usually asked, and something in her tone told me it was not idle curiosity dressed up as small talk. I told her carefully that I trusted him the way any father learns to trust a son-in-law after 12 years of watching him show up for the people who matter most. She nodded slowly, said nothing else about it, and left shortly afterward, hugging me longer at the door than she normally does before driving away. Jonas mentioned later that same evening that he had noticed unusual activity on Emily's personal email account. Activity that suggested she had been searching quietly and repeatedly over the past several days for information about medical incapacity proceedings, executive succession law, and something else that stopped all three of us cold when Jonas read it aloud to the room. A search conducted at nearly midnight, 2 nights earlier, for the exact phrase, "What happens to a shell company when it is used in a fraud investigation?" Diane and I sat with that information for a long while, turning over what it might actually mean for all of us.
It was possible Emily had simply grown suspicious on her own, piecing together fragments the same way I once had from a phone call that did not add up. A look on her husband's face that lasted a beat too long. A comment from her mother-in-law that revealed more than it was ever meant to. It was also possible she already knew far more than any of us realized, and had known it for far longer than any of us wanted to seriously consider that evening. That uncertainty sat unresolved between Diane and me, until the call finally came the following evening, less than 2 days before the scheduled board meeting. Emily's voice, when she finally spoke, did not sound like a woman confirming weekend plans or asking about dinner reservations. It sounded like someone standing at the edge of a decision she had been quietly circling for weeks, finally forcing herself to step toward it out loud, no matter what it cost her afterward. "Dad, I need to tell you something before Thursday," she said. And then, before I could answer, before I could even ask what or why now, or whether she was safe, the line simply went dead in my hand. I called her back immediately, my heart already pounding harder than it had in weeks. It rang 4 times and went to voicemail. I called again 10 minutes later, and again 15 minutes after that, with the same result each time. Her voice recording asking me to leave a message after the tone. A version of her voice that sounded nothing like the one that had just spoken. 4 words heavy enough to keep me awake for the rest of that entire night. I told Diane about the call within the hour, and she went quiet in a way that worried me considerably more than if she had simply reacted with alarm right away. She said we now had 2 possibilities sitting in front of us, and neither one felt comfortable to consider seriously. Either Emily was preparing to warn Marcus that something was closing in around him, protecting her marriage the only way she still knew how to protect it, or Emily was preparing to warn me, instead choosing at what might be the last possible moment available to her to step away from whatever she had allowed herself to quietly become part of over these past several months. I did not know which version of my daughter would walk into that boardroom on Thursday morning. And for the first time, since this entire nightmare began with a simple lie about a client in Dallas, I found myself more afraid of that uncertainty than of anything Marcus Sloan or Ashcroft Sterling had ever built against me. Every piece of evidence we had carefully gathered told me exactly how to defeat my son-in-law in front of the board. Nothing we had gathered told me how to survive whatever Emily was about to do next, or which side of this she had finally chosen to stand on. Marcus's hands were completely steady when he tore open the sealed envelope containing the fabricated diagnosis in front of 11 board members. And I remember thinking, watching him do it, that steady hands were the one thing I had never actually accounted for in any version of this plan. Let me take you into that boardroom exactly as it happened, because everything that unfolded over the next 40 minutes changed the entire trajectory of this family, this company, and every relationship sitting inside both of them, permanently and completely. Thursday morning arrived with a heavy gray sky that matched almost nothing about how I actually felt walking into that building. I had dressed deliberately in a suit that fit slightly loose, a small detail meant to reinforce the fragile impression I had spent weeks carefully building for exactly this moment. I took my usual seat at the head of the long table and let my shoulders slump forward, my gaze drifting toward the middle distance the way Diane had coached me to hold it. Tired, distant, entirely unthreatening to anyone watching closely. The 11 directors filed in over the following 20 minutes, senior people I had known for decades, several of whom had personally watched Marcus grow from an eager young coordinator into a trusted vice president under my own direct guidance across many years. I could feel their eyes moving toward me with a mixture of quiet pity and cautious calculation. Exactly the reaction weeks of carefully planted rumors about my supposed decline had been designed to produce in a room full of people who trusted him completely. Marcus entered precisely on schedule, flanked by outside legal counsel, wearing the kind of composed, solemn expression a man practices in a mirror when he wants grief to look convincing, rather than performed for an audience. He paused briefly beside my chair, placed a hand on my shoulder, and asked, loud enough for the nearest directors to hear clearly, whether I was feeling well enough for the proceedings today. I nodded slowly, keeping my hands folded together to hide how steady they actually were beneath the table. The early agenda items passed quickly. Quarterly reports acknowledged routine disclosures, filed away without much discussion from anyone in the room. Everyone present understood that the real purpose of this meeting still remained ahead of us, and the air carried that particular electricity of people quietly waiting for something they already suspected was coming their way. At exactly 10:30, Marcus stood slowly from his chair. He spoke first about the company's legacy, about my 4 decades of dedication, layering his voice with a paternal reverence so thick it nearly convinced even me that he believed it himself in that moment. Then his tone shifted heavy and sorrowful, and he announced that the family had noticed a severe decline in my cognitive abilities over recent months. Memory lapses, confusion over basic financial matters, a pattern he claimed had broken his heart to witness. In silence, for as long as he possibly could bear it, he reached into his briefcase and withdrew the sealed envelope containing Dr. Ashford's fabricated diagnosis. Tearing it open with those steady, confident hands, sliding copies down the table for every director to examine closely. I watched the room absorb it, murmurs rippling outward as pages turned, one after another, the weight of a professional diagnosis doing exactly the damage it had been manufactured months earlier to eventually do to me. Marcus let the silence stretch before invoking the emergency incapacity provision, directly requesting an immediate board vote to transfer executive authority into his own hands. He looked directly at me while he said it, his eyes carrying no warmth beneath the practiced sorrow, and asked the room to let, as he phrased it carefully, the old lion finally rest after everything he had given this company. I did not raise my voice. I let out a slow, quiet laugh instead, one that rippled unexpected confusion across the entire table. I reached beneath the edge of my desk and pressed a small button Diane had installed there 2 days earlier, exactly for this purpose. The double doors at the back of the boardroom swung open, and Diane walked in first, followed by Dr. Neil Ashford, pale and visibly trembling. And behind them both, a federal financial crimes investigator Diane had quietly briefed the previous afternoon after Ashford's sworn statement finally gave us enough legal grounds to involve federal authorities directly in this matter. The chairman demanded an explanation immediately, his voice sharp with genuine alarm. I addressed the room calmly, thanking Marcus first for his performance, then explaining plainly that the diagnosis he had just distributed to 11 directors was entirely fabricated, paid for through embezzled company funds, routed through a shell corporation controlled by a man posing as an independent consultant, a man who in reality worked directly for Ashcroft Sterling Group, a private equity firm actively attempting to force a hostile acquisition of this company through precisely this kind of engineered crisis. Dr. Ashford confirmed it himself, his voice shaking, but perfectly clear, describing the arrangement, the payment, and Marcus's exact role in personally commissioning the false report months earlier. The investigator confirmed that federal authorities had already begun examining Ashcroft Sterling's documented pattern of similar acquisitions across 3 other family-owned companies, in 2 entirely different states over recent years. Marcus stood frozen at the far end of the table, his composed grief collapsing instantly into something raw and completely unguarded. He looked desperately toward the door, as if searching for Sloan, for anyone who might still rescue a plan now unraveling in front of 11 witnesses who had personally trusted him for over a decade of loyal service. Then the door opened once more, and Emily walked in alone, without Marcus's legal counsel, without anyone escorting her through the hallway. She did not look at her husband even once. She walked directly to where Diane stood near the front of the room and handed her a thick folder, quietly stating that it contained every message she had personally intercepted from Marcus's private phone over the past 10 days. Proof that she had known enough to act and had chosen in the end to act for the truth rather than protect a marriage built on a lie. Marcus fell to his knees, right there on the boardroom floor, reaching for my hand with fingers that were no longer steady at all. And I remember thinking that this was the exact moment I had been quietly waiting weeks to see, and that it brought me no satisfaction whatsoever. Let me walk you through everything that happened after Emily handed Diane that folder, because the next several hours reshaped this family more permanently than any single meeting ever should. The boardroom fell into stunned silence once the investigator confirmed federal authorities already had an open file on Ashcroft Sterling Group's broader pattern of acquisitions. Marcus's own legal counsel stepped back from the table slightly, the particular retreat of an attorney realizing his client's story had just collapsed in front of 11 witnesses who would remember every detail of this morning for years afterward. Marcus looked around the room, searching for support that no longer existed anywhere within it. He slid out of his chair and dropped to his knees beside me, grabbing for my hand, begging me to reverse whatever was happening, insisting he was still my son, that family had to mean something even now. I looked down at him with a stillness that surprised even myself and told him quietly that he had forfeited the right to call me family the moment he decided my mind was worth erasing for $15 million and a board seat he had not earned honestly. The investigator stepped forward and asked Marcus to stand, informing him that federal agents would need a full statement regarding his communications with both Sloan and Ashcroft Sterling Group, along with documentation of the loan structured against his own shares. Marcus did not resist. Whatever fight had carried him into that boardroom that morning had already drained completely out of him by the time 2 agents waiting outside the door escorted him toward a separate room to begin that conversation formally. Dr. Ashford remained seated quietly near the back wall throughout, occasionally answering direct questions from board members who wanted to understand exactly how convincing a fabricated diagnosis could actually look on paper. He confirmed, when asked directly, that his cooperation had come entirely from Diane's visit 2 days earlier, and that he intended to surrender his medical license voluntarily, rather than wait for a board to strip it from him through disciplinary proceedings that would take considerably longer to conclude. Emily stayed beside me for the remainder of that meeting, saying very little, answering only the questions directors asked her directly. She explained that she had grown suspicious nearly 3 weeks earlier after overhearing a phone call between Marcus and her own mother that mentioned my name alongside a phrase she did not understand at the time, something about a proxy vote and a timeline. She had begun quietly checking his phone at night, copying messages onto her own device before deleting the evidence of having done so, terrified the entire time that she was either about to destroy her marriage over nothing or about to discover something she would never be able to unsee. She told the board, and later told me privately, that the moment she finally understood the full scope of what Marcus had done, she considered warning him instead of me, out of 12 years of habit, rather than loyalty to anything he had actually earned. She said the call she made to me 2 nights before Thursday, the one that ended so abruptly, had been an attempt to warn me directly, cut short only because Marcus had walked into the room unexpectedly before she could finish the sentence. After the board formally voted to remove Marcus from every executive position within the company, unanimous and immediate, Diane and I spent the remainder of that afternoon working through the practical unraveling of everything Ashcroft Sterling Group had quietly built. Federal investigators confirmed within days that the $15 million guarantee structure Marcus had signed personally, believing it protected him, instead left him and Sloan Peak Advisory holding full legal liability for an acquisition loan neither of them could actually cover. Once Calloway Infrastructure Group formally withdrew its name from the paperwork entirely,
Victor Sloan, whose real name turned out to be Richard Halloway, according to federal filings, was arrested within the week, along with 2 other Ashcroft Sterling employees connected to similar schemes uncovered against 2 other family companies. Once investigators began pulling that thread, the firm itself faced a formal securities investigation that would take years to resolve, though its reputation among family-owned businesses in this state was finished within days of the news becoming public. I did not disown Emily. I could not, after watching her walk into that boardroom alone, choosing truth over the comfortable lie her marriage had offered her for 12 years. She filed for divorce from Marcus within a month, and I helped her quietly and without conditions rebuild a life that no longer depended on anyone else's permission. Marcus, facing federal charges for wire fraud and conspiracy, eventually pled guilty in exchange for a reduced sentence, a resolution I neither celebrated nor mourned. I spent the following months doing something I had not done in years, reviewing every clause in my own company's bylaws personally, closing the exact loopholes that had once nearly cost me everything I built. I also established a scholarship fund for young tradespeople starting out the way I once did, with nothing but a truck and a box of tools. Because if this entire ordeal taught me anything, it is that the people worth trusting are rarely the ones who inherit a legacy. They are the ones willing to build their own from nothing, the same way I once did. And the same way I intend to keep helping others do, for as long as I still can. If someone in your own family tried to take everything you built, would you have forgiven them? Or would you have made them regret it the way I did? There is a particular kind of quiet that settles over a man once the fighting is finally finished. And it is not the quiet of peace. It is the quiet of understanding something you wish you had understood 20 years earlier. Blood does not guarantee loyalty, and the people who inherit our trust are not always the people who deserve to keep it. We spend our lives building something to hand down to the next generation, hoping they will inherit our values along with our success. And sometimes that hope is not enough to protect either one. Real love, the kind that actually means something, occasionally requires the courage to stop being someone's safety net, even when that someone shares your blood and your name. I think about Emily more than I think about Marcus these days. About the 12 years she spent believing loyalty and blindness were the same thing, and about the single evening she finally understood they were not. I think about the young man I once was, sleeping in a truck, with nothing but a box of tools and a stubborn refusal to quit. And how far that man traveled, only to almost lose everything to someone who never once had to struggle for any of it. If you are still watching, I want to ask you something. Honestly, if your own family tried to take everything you built using your own trust as the weapon against you, would you forgive them and hope they change? Or would you do exactly what I did and make absolutely certain they understood who they were really dealing with? Tell me in the comments. And if this story reminded you that karma always collects its debts, eventually, hit that like button before you go, and stay close, because there are more stories like this one still coming. In the end, I didn't have to destroy Marcus. I simply handed him the rope, and he tied every knot himself. So tell me, if your own family used your trust as a weapon, would you forgive them or make them regret it? Comment below. Hit like if you believe karma always collects. And subscribe to MaleRevenge. The next story is already waiting.